Alessandro Moretti, the undisputed capo of New York, stepped into Letto Noir, and the life drained from the room. Every eye fixed on the man who held the city's skyline in the palm of his hand. But his companion for the evening made a terrible error. She mocked the waitress. Tapping a dismissive finger on the wine list, she sneered. "She cannot even decipher the menu, Alessandro. It is absolutely pathetic." What she failed to realize was that this waitress possessed a secret, a truth powerful enough to incinerate their entire empire. When Sophie finally chose to speak, her words did more than just read a menu. They struck the devil himself silent. This is the unbelievable story of how one spilled glass of red wine would forever alter the balance of power in the city's underworld. This is a story about a woman who proved that real power is not built on money or violence. It is built on intelligence, courage, and the refusal to be invisible. If you have ever been underestimated, overlooked, or told you were not enough, this story is for you. The rain falling over Manhattan never washed anything clean. It only polished the grime to a darker shine. Inside the opulent walls of Letto Noir, however, the world outside was a distant memory. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of inherited wealth, expensive truffle oil, and a baseline of pure fear. Sophie carefully polished the silverware at table 4, her movements precise despite the slight, betraying tremble in her fingers. The tremor wasn't from the chill, but from a profound, gnawing hunger. She had not had a proper meal in over 2 days, getting by on the hardened baguettes that Jean-Luc, the sous chef, would toss out the kitchen door around midnight. For the wealthy patrons of Letto Noir, Sophie was simply invisible, a functional part of the scenery. She was a fleeting shadow of black and white, a phantom carrying a notepad. "You must check your appearance, Sophie," Monsieur Laurent, the maitre d' hissed, gliding past her with a predator's grace. "Table 4 is now reserved for the Moretti party." That single name made the air in the restaurant drop by 10 degrees. Sophie's entire body went rigid. Every soul in New York knew of the Morettis. Their influence had grown far beyond the unions and the shipping docks. They now owned the very skyline. Alessandro Moretti, the youngest and most notoriously ruthless don of the family, was a man whose quietest whisper carried more weight than a gunshot. He was famous for 2 things: his terrifying, calculating silence and his unwavering demand for absolute perfection in all things. "I am prepared, monsieur," Sophie whispered back, carefully tucking a loose strand of honey-colored hair behind her ear. She made a point to keep her gaze lowered. That was the most important rule of survival here. Look down. Stay alive. At precisely 8 o'clock in the evening, the grand oak doors swung inward. The restaurant, which usually maintained a civilized hum of muted conversation and the gentle clinking of crystal, was plunged into an unnerving, total silence. It felt as if all the oxygen had been violently vacuumed from the room. Alessandro Moretti entered first. He was even taller than he appeared in the grainy paparazzi photographs, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that undoubtedly cost more than every dollar Sophie had ever earned. His face was a carved mask of detached indifference, his jawline so sharp it could cut diamonds, and his dark eyes were intelligent but completely devoid of any warmth. Flanking him were 2 massive bodyguards, men who looked as if they had been chiseled from solid granite, and a woman. This woman was breathtaking in the way a flawless diamond is breathtaking, cold, brilliant, and created solely for admiration. She was poured into a scarlet dress that clung to her body like a second skin. This was Camilla Vans, or rather Camilla Russo, a socialite desperately trying to secure a marriage proposal before the end of the financial quarter. "This way, signore." Laurent offered a bow so deep his nose almost grazed the polished floor. He led them to table 4, which was situated in Sophie's assigned section. She dutifully waited the mandatory 30 seconds before making her approach. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribcage, like a small trapped bird. She desperately needed to keep this job. She needed every single tip. Her rent was already 3 weeks overdue, and her landlord, A perpetually sweating man named Mr. Henderson had ominously promised to change the locks on her apartment by Friday. "Good evening," Sophie said, her voice barely a whisper, but remarkably steady. "May I bring some water for the table?" Alessandro did not even bother to look up from his watch, an exquisite vintage Patek Philippe. He simply gestured with a dismissive wave of his hand. Camilla, on the other hand, looked directly at her. Her critical eyes swept over Sophie, from her worn-out shoes to her slightly frayed collar, her upper lip curling with instant revulsion. To someone like Camilla, Sophie was not another human being. She was merely an inconvenient obstacle standing between her and Alessandro's undivided attention. "Sparkling," Camilla snapped without preamble. "And fetch the wine list. The reserve list, not the cheap house garbage you offer to tourists." "Certainly, madame." Sophie retreated to retrieve the heavy, leather-bound volume. Upon her return, she placed it with reverence in front of Alessandro. He continued to ignore it. "Read it for me, darling," he said to Camilla, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate through Sophie's very bones. "I am developing a headache." "Oh, of course," Camilla whined prettily. She opened the massive book, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the aged parchment. But as her gaze drifted across the pages, her confident smile began to fade. The menu at Lido Noir was not just written in French. It was composed in an archaic, almost poetic form of the language, handwritten in an elaborate cursive script that detailed obscure vintages and remote regions which would require a master sommelier to properly interpret. Camilla squinted, trying to make sense of the words. She nervously flipped one page, and then another. She finally let out a tense little laugh. "Well," Camilla giggled, theatrically tossing her perfect hair, "it is all just French, is it not? Alessandro, why do we not simply order the Cabernet?" "Because I do not want a Cabernet," Alessandro stated flatly, his attention finally lifting from his watch. His dark eyes drilled into Camilla. "I want the 82 Bordeaux. Find it for me." A flicker of panic crossed Camilla's face as she frantically scanned the page again. She pointed her finger at a random line of text. "Here, this one right here." Sophie was leaning forward to pour the water. Her gaze unintentionally fell to the line Camilla had indicated. It was not a Bordeaux at all. It was an inexpensive table wine from the Loire Valley, its price massively inflated for unsuspecting tourists. "Actually," Camilla snapped, noticing Sophie's brief glance. She felt utterly foolish, and she desperately needed someone to blame. "Why do you not ask her? Just look at her." Camilla let out a cruel, tinkling laugh that seemed to echo through the now deathly quiet restaurant. "She is staring at the page as if she is trying to solve a complex equation. She probably cannot even read the menu, Alessandro. It is just pathetic. These establishments will hire anyone right off the street these days." The entire restaurant fell completely still. Nearby, diners froze in place, their forks hovering inches from their open mouths. Alessandro slowly shifted in his chair. He looked at Sophie for the very first time. He truly saw her. He noticed the worn cuffs of her uniform, the exhaustion in her eyes, the inexpensive shoes on her feet. "Is that true?" Alessandro asked, his voice becoming dangerously soft. "Can you not read the menu?" It was an impossible question, a carefully laid trap. If she answered yes, she would be branded incompetent and fired. If she said no, she would be accused of arguing with a powerful guest, a cardinal sin in the service industry. Camilla smirked, sensing her victory. "Of course she is incapable. Go on, get someone who actually knows what they are doing. Shoo!" Sophie stood frozen, the insult burning like a hot coal in her stomach. It was not the casual cruelty that wounded her so deeply. It was the absolute assumption of her ignorance. They looked at her and saw only a waitress. They saw a complete nobody. They did not see Sophie Dubois, a former prodigy of the Sorbonne, the daughter of a disgraced French diplomat who had spent the summers of her youth wandering the sun-drenched vineyards of Provence, long before her father's gambling addiction had shattered their lives and forced them to flee into hiding in America. Sophie's hand tightened around the heavy glass water pitcher. She knew she should just walk away. She should find Monsieur Laurent and let him handle it. But then her eyes met Alessandro's. He was not sneering at her like Camilla. He was observing her with a strange, predatory curiosity. He was waiting, testing her, to see if she would shatter under the pressure. Sophie took a single, deliberate breath. She placed the pitcher on the table. The sound was a soft, definitive thud against the fine linen. She turned to face Camilla, her posture transforming as she straightened her spine. The timid, submissive slouch of a servant completely vanished. "Vous vous trompez, mademoiselle," Sophie stated, and her voice had utterly changed. The hesitant, faintly American accent was gone, replaced by the flawless, crisp, and melodic cadence of a native Parisian. Camilla could only blink in stunned confusion. "What?" Sophie continued, her unwavering gaze now locked directly onto Alessandro's. She spoke in perfect French, the words flowing with such effortless grace that it sounded like a beautiful, dangerous song. "That is a muscadet. It is a dry white wine, known for its high acidity, and is typically served with oysters. It is most certainly not a Bordeaux. If Monsieur desires the 1982 vintage, he is searching for the Chateau Mouton Rothschild, which is located on page 14, the third line from the bottom." She reached forward, her hand perfectly steady, and flipped through the heavy pages of the wine list with a single practiced motion. She stopped precisely on page 14. "Furthermore," Sophie switched to impeccable, unaccented English, her tone now coolly professional, "the vintage you were indicating, mademoiselle, is known to be corked. Monsieur Laurent keeps it on the list as a method for testing the knowledge of tourists. I would never dream of serving it to a palate as obviously refined as Mr. Moretti's." Silence. A thick, absolute, suffocating silence descended on the room. Monsieur Laurent, who had been rushing over to de-escalate the situation, skidded to an abrupt halt, his mouth hanging wide open in disbelief. Camilla's face had turned a shocking shade of crimson. She began to sputter. "How dare you? How dare you speak to me like that?" Alessandro simply raised his hand, lifting a single finger. Camilla's mouth snapped shut as if on a hinge. Alessandro slowly shifted his gaze from the wine list to Sophie. The look of boredom had been completely erased from his eyes. In its place was something far more potent and far more dangerous: genuine interest. "You speak French," Alessandro stated. It was not a question, it was a fact. "I do," Sophie replied, holding his intense gaze without flinching. She was almost certain she was about to be fired. At this point, she did not care. "And you have a knowledge of wine." "I know that serving a muscadet with a fine steak would be a crime against humanity, signore." A corner of Alessandro's mouth twitched, the ghost of a smile. "What is your name?" "Sophie." "Sophie." He tested the sound of her name, rolling it on his tongue as if it were a sip of fine whiskey. "You are not from Brooklyn, are you, Sophie?" "Everyone is from somewhere, Mr. Moretti. For tonight, I am simply from table 4. Alessandro held her gaze for another long, heavy moment. Then he snapped the wine list shut. "Get the Rothschild," he commanded, his eyes never leaving hers. "And bring an additional glass." Camilla immediately brightened. "Oh, Alessandro, you are far too kind to me." "The glass is not for you," Alessandro said, his voice like ice, cutting her off completely. He gestured to the empty chair directly across from him, the one right next to Camilla. His gesture was for her. He pointed a single commanding finger at Sophie. "Sit down, Sophie." A collective gasp echoed through the restaurant. A mere waitress being invited to sit with the Don. It was completely unheard of. It was a death sentence. "Sir, I cannot," Sophie stammered, the surge of adrenaline now giving way to a wave of pure terror. "I am on my shift. Monsieur Laurent will fire me." Alessandro turned his head just slightly, directing his chillingly calm gaze toward the terrified manager who stood frozen 5 feet away. "Laurent," Alessandro said softly. "Sophie is finished. Her shift was over. From this moment on, she would be dining with me, and everything will be on my account. And let me be perfectly clear, if she loses her job over this, Leto Noir will be a pile of smoking ash before sunrise. Is that understood? Laurent's head bobbed so violently his glasses slid down his nose. Yes, Mr. Moretti. Absolutely, of course. He turned to Sophie. Please, sit. Sophie's eyes darted from the empty velvet chair to the venomous, utterly disgraced face of Camilla, and then finally to the deep, starless voids that were Alessandro Moretti's eyes. She lowered herself into the seat. In that single motion, one life was extinguished, and a far more dangerous one ignited. The chair's fabric was plush and sinfully soft, a universe away from the hard, splintered wood of the break-room stool where she usually ate her day-old bread. But the luxurious velvet was lost on her. The only thing she could register was the crushing intensity of Alessandro Moretti's gaze. It felt tangible, a physical pressure settling over her, like a firm hand closing around her windpipe. Across the polished table, Camilla Russo looked like she had just swallowed acid. Her carefully constructed makeup couldn't hide the cracks in her composure or the raw, unfiltered fury burning in her eyes. Alessandro, Camilla hissed, her voice a venomous, trembling whisper. This must be some kind of sick joke. A test, is that it? You are actually allowing the hired help to join us? Alessandro's attention remained fixed on Sophie. As if Camilla had ceased to exist, he spoke to Sophie alone. Pour the wine. Sophie's hands betrayed her with a tremor as she reached for the magnificent bottle of Chateau Mouton Rothschild. It was a vintage from 1982. A bottle whose value exceeded what she earned in 3 entire months of exhausting work. With an ingrained, fluid grace, she decanted the priceless liquid, allowing the instincts of a forgotten life to guide her movements. She poured a small amount for Alessandro to approve. He lifted the glass, swirling the deep crimson wine, breathing in its complex bouquet before taking a deliberate sip. A slow, affirmative nod was his only response. Sophie then filled his glass before pouring one for herself. She pointedly ignored Camilla's empty glass. "Are you ignoring me?" Camilla shrieked, her palm slamming down on the table with a loud crack. The fine silverware jumped in protest. "I am Senator Russo's daughter. My father is going to—" "Your father," Alessandro cut in, his voice a low, indifferent drawl, "is indebted to me for 3 significant favors and a sum of $4 million. If I were to call him and explain that I abandoned you on a street corner simply because your presence became tedious, he would almost certainly offer me a sincere apology for the trouble you caused." Camilla's jaw dropped, her mouth hanging open in stunned silence. Alessandro then shifted his focus completely back to the waitress, as if nothing had happened. "Sophie, tell me what you think of this wine." Sophie raised her glass and took a small sip. The flavor that bloomed on her tongue was a ghost, a perfect echo of a memory. It tasted of black currants, rich cedar, and the faint, pleasant aroma of a cigar box. It tasted of her father's library on a quiet afternoon, long before the sirens and the raids. It was the taste of feeling safe. "It is bold," Sophie stated, her voice barely a whisper. "The structure is flawless. The tannins have mellowed beautifully over time, yet they retain their essential power. The finish is remarkably long. It is a survivor." "A survivor?" Alessandro echoed, his eyes studying her with unnerving focus. "Much like yourself?" Sophie carefully placed her glass back on the table. "I have no idea what you are suggesting, sir." "Oh, please," Camilla snarled, pushing her chair back with a screech. She snatched her purse from the table, her knuckles stark white against the expensive leather. "I refuse to sit here for this ridiculous performance. If you want to share a meal with this little sewer rat, then I hope you catch something." She spun around to make a dramatic exit, but paused, grabbing her glass of water. With a final, hateful sneer aimed at Sophie, she flung the entire contents of the glass forward. The world seemed to slow to a crawl. Sophie instinctively squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the shocking cold of the water. But the icy splash never made contact. She blinked her eyes open to an impossible sight. Alessandro had moved with a speed that seemed to bend reality itself. His hand was raised, forming a barrier that intercepted the entire splash. Cold water dripped from the sleeve of his tailored suit jacket, pooling on the pristine white tablecloth. He had not lost a single drop of his own wine. The restaurant, which had been buzzing with low chatter, fell into a profound, breathless silence. Even the clatter from the kitchen had vanished. Alessandro rose to his feet with a slow, deliberate grace. He shrugged off his damp jacket, handing it to a bodyguard who looked as if he were carved from stone. He then turned his gaze on Camilla. "Leave," he breathed. The word was not a command. It was an epitaph, as final as the sound of a tomb sealing shut. The color drained from Camilla's face as the full weight of her mistake crashed down on her. She had just physically assaulted a Mafia capo. She whirled around and fled, the frantic clicking of her heels on the polished floor, the only sound until she disappeared out the door and into the pouring rain. Alessandro settled back into his seat. He was now just in his crisp dress shirt, the fine white cotton stretched taut across his powerful shoulders, revealing the clear outline of a gun holster nestled under his left arm. He made no effort to conceal it. "My apologies," he said, his voice calm and even. "The garbage has been disposed of." Sophie could only stare at him, her mind reeling. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because you can distinguish a Muscadet from a Bordeaux," he answered, smoothly slicing into a thick steak. "And also because your eyes hold the look of someone who is desperately running from their past. I have a profound dislike for squandered potential." He savored a piece of the steak, chewing with methodical patience before gesturing toward her with his fork. "Eat. You look as though you have not had a proper meal in a week." Sophie hesitantly lifted her own fork. The truth was, she was ravenous. The rich, savory scent of the perfectly cooked ribeye was almost overwhelming. She took a small bite and had to physically restrain a sigh of pure, unadulterated pleasure. "So," Alessandro mused, swirling the crimson wine in his glass. "Sophie, a woman with no last name who speaks flawless French, possesses an expert's knowledge of rare vintages, yet toils at a dead-end job where the manager clearly has her terrified. Allow me to speculate." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intensifying until it felt like a physical touch. "A disgraced socialite? No, there is too much strength in you for that. A runaway wife, perhaps? No, I see no faint mark from a ring on your finger, which leaves only one logical conclusion: trouble with your family." Sophie went rigid, the fork clattering from her numb fingers onto the plate. "I am just a waitress, Mr. Moretti." "Liar." The word was followed by a slow smile, a predatory parting of his lips that revealed unnervingly perfect white teeth. "You are Arthur Dubois' daughter." The wineglass tumbled from Sophie's grasp. It did not just break on the table, it shattered, an explosion of fine crystal. The priceless 1982 Rothschild spilled across the white linen, spreading in a dark red stain that looked exactly like a fatal wound. "How?" Sophie whispered, the words catching in her throat as a glacial chill spread through her veins. "How could you possibly know that name?" "Your father was a celebrated figure in certain circles, a true artist of the smuggling trade," Alessandro explained, completely untroubled by the spreading stain on the table. He calmly motioned for Laurent to bring another napkin. He specialized in moving priceless art, rare gems, and sensitive information. They called him the diplomat for his finesse. But then, 3 years ago, he disappeared after acquiring something incredibly valuable, something that was not his to take. Alessandro's expression became hard as steel. "Something that belonged to my family." Sophie scrambled backward in her chair, a wave of pure, suffocating panic rising within her. "I swear, I do not know where he is. I have not had any contact with him in 3 years. Please just let me go home." "Going home is no longer an option for you, Sophie," Alessandro stated, his voice now gentle but laced with grim finality. "Why is that?" "Because if I was able to locate you," he said, tipping his head toward the rain-streaked window where the silhouettes of large, dark vehicles were waiting, "then it means Stefano Greco has found you as well. And you must understand, unlike me, Greco has no appreciation for fine wine. He has a taste for blood. As if summoned by his very name, the massive front window of Le Val Noir did not just break. It detonated inward. The sound was a deafening explosion of crystalline glass, which rained across the elegant dining room like a shower of deadly diamonds. Screams tore through the air as wealthy patrons scrambled for cover beneath their tables. Sophie never had a chance to scream. Before her mind could even register that they were under attack, an immense force crashed into her, sending her and the chair tumbling backward to the floor. Alessandro was covering her, his powerful body a human shield over her own. She was enveloped by the solid warmth of his chest and the jarring scent of gunpowder mixed with a refined, expensive cologne. A rapid succession of pops echoed through the room. Pop, pop, pop. Bullets ripped through the velvet cushions of the booth where they had been sitting just a heartbeat ago. Behind the bar, rows of liquor bottles erupted in cascades of alcohol and glittering shards, forcing the terrified bartender to the ground. "Stay down!" Alessandro's voice boomed, a roar of pure authority that sliced through the pandemonium. With the chaos swirling around him, he drew a sleek, matte black handgun from its holster. He fired 3 controlled shots back toward the shattered window, each one a calm, calculated action meant to suppress their assailants. "Dante, the rear exit!" Alessandro commanded. One of his bodyguards, the man named Dante, was already in motion, upending a heavy dining table to create a makeshift barrier as he began to return fire. Sophie was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering with such force that it hurt her jaw. "What is happening? Who are those men?" "Greco!" Alessandro spat the name like a poison. He looked down at her, his intense gaze just inches from her face. A thin line of blood trickled down his cheek from a small cut caused by the flying glass. "He is after you. He is convinced you possess the key." "The key to what?" Sophie cried out, hot tears mingling with the fine dust that now coated her face. "I do not have anything of value." "We are moving right now." Alessandro's hand clamped around her arm, his grip as unyielding as forged iron. He pulled her to her feet, forcing her to stay low as they sprinted toward the restaurant's kitchen. They crashed through the swinging doors, causing the startled chefs to cry out in alarm. "Get out the back! Go now!" Alessandro yelled at the staff. The kitchen crew needed no further encouragement, fleeing into the back alley as one. Alessandro pulled Sophie through the maze of stainless steel counters, hissing steam, and the smell of grease, bursting through the heavy steel door and out into the slick, rain-soaked darkness. A massive black armored sport utility vehicle screeched to a halt directly in their path, its side door sliding open before it had fully stopped. "Get inside," Alessandro ordered, shoving her into the vehicle's interior before vaulting in right behind her. The tires screamed in protest, leaving smoking trails on the wet asphalt as the driver accelerated away with brutal force. Just then, a motorcycle rounded the corner, its rider raising a submachine gun. A spray of bullets hammered against the vehicle, but they sparked harmlessly against the thick, reinforced glass of the windows. Sophie could only huddle in the far corner of the plush leather seat, hugging her knees to her chest. She was drenched, trembling, and spiraling into shock. Alessandro, in stark contrast, sat across from her. He calmly ejected his weapon's magazine, checked it, and then reholstered the gun before meticulously straightening the cuffs of his shirt. He appeared so unnervingly composed, as if he were merely departing from a tedious corporate meeting instead of a violent gunfight. "Are you wounded?" he asked, his voice steady. Sophie ran her hands over her arms and legs. "No. No, I do not think so." She then looked at him more closely. "But you are. You're bleeding." Alessandro lightly touched the cut on his cheek, then glanced at the smear of blood on his fingertips. "It is insignificant." He opened a hidden compartment in the central armrest, retrieving a bottle of water and a clean white towel. He tossed them both to her. "Clean yourself up. You look like you have seen a ghost." Sophie gratefully wiped the grime and tears from her face. You said they are looking for a key." "What key?" "My father left my family with nothing but mountains of debt." We lost our vineyard, our apartment in Paris, absolutely everything. I have been working as a waitress for 2 years, just trying to afford the rent on a tiny room. Alessandro observed her intently, his sharp eyes tracking every flicker of emotion, every subtle shift in her expression. He was a master at reading people, a human polygraph forged in the fires of the criminal underworld. He could see her fear, her profound confusion, and her bone-deep exhaustion. What he did not see was a single trace of deceit. Arthur did not just steal money, Sophie. He stole a digital ledger. It is an encrypted hard drive that contains all the routing numbers and access codes for the entire East Coast Syndicate's network of offshore accounts. Greco wants it so he can seize control of the city. I want it to make sure that never happens. I do not have it, Sophie insisted, her voice tight with fear. Alejandro's voice was low and smooth. Perhaps you do not know you have it. But Arthur was a deeply sentimental man. He would have concealed it somewhere near you, somewhere he believed was absolutely safe. The luxury car began to slow its pace. Sophie stared out the window, her heart pounding. They had left the familiar lights of Manhattan far behind. Now, they were crossing a massive bridge, moving toward the dark industrial shapes of the docks. Just when she thought they were heading for a deserted warehouse, the car swerved, aiming for a towering high-rise that cast a long shadow over the river. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded. "To my home," Alejandro replied simply. "No," Sophie's voice rose in panic. "Take me back to my apartment. I need my things. My mother's locket is there. It is all I have left." Alejandro let out a long, weary sigh. He tapped lightly on the glass partition separating them from the driver. "Driver, we are making a detour. Head to Queens 42nd Street. The driver, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, rumbled in protest. "Sir, that neighborhood is not secure." Alejandro's command cut through the air like a blade. "Just do it." The journey to Queens was shrouded in a heavy, suffocating silence. As they pulled up in front of Sophie's building, a worn-out brick structure with paint peeling off in sad strips, Alejandro instructed his men to remain on guard. "I will accompany you upstairs," he stated. "I am perfectly capable of packing my own bag," Sophie retorted, trying to hold on to the last remaining piece of her dignity. "Sophie," Alejandro's voice dropped, becoming a serious, low rumble. "Look up at your door." Sophie's eyes shot up to the second-floor window of her apartment. A single light was burning inside. She never, ever left the light on. She threw the car door open and bolted. "Sophie, wait for me." Alejandro swore under his breath and sprinted after her. Sophie flew up the stairs, taking them two at a time. She finally reached her landing, her own front door. The lock had been completely destroyed. The wooden frame around it was splintered and broken. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door inward. A scream formed in her throat but died before it could escape. The entire apartment had been violently gutted. Her mattress was sliced open, its cotton stuffing pouring out like the insides of a butchered animal. The cheap dresser her father had bought her was smashed into pieces. Her clothes were ripped and thrown everywhere. The wooden floorboards had been pried up, leaving ugly gashes. Even the wallpaper was torn from the walls. "No," she whimpered, a sound of pure agony. She dropped to her knees, crawling through the wreckage of her small life. "No, no, no." She reached under the shattered remains of her bed frame, her fingers searching for a loose floorboard she had always used as a secret hiding place. It was gone. The entire board had been ripped out. "The locket," she sobbed, her body shaking. "They took my mother's locket. It had the only photograph I have of her inside." Alejandro appeared in the doorway behind her. He scanned the scene of utter destruction with a cold, professional gaze. This had all the markings of Greco's men. It was messy, brutal, and designed to send a message. He walked across the room to where Sophie was kneeling in the ruins. He did not offer her empty comforts. He did not tell her that everything would be all right. Instead, he crouched down, the fine fabric of his expensive suit, trousers brushing against the filthy, splintered floor. He reached out and gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his intense eyes. They did not find what they were truly looking for, Alejandro said, his voice firm. But they took everything, Sophie cried, tears streaming down her face. They took worthless junk and cheap trinkets. If they had located the drive, Sophie, they would have set this entire building on fire just to erase their tracks. This means they are still actively searching for it. He rose to his feet and offered her his hand. You have absolutely nothing left for you here, Sophie. You have no job. You have no home. You have no past anymore. Sophie stared at his outstretched hand. It was a large hand with calloused skin, a steady hand. It was the hand of a killer. But in that moment, it was the only thing in her entire world that was not broken. Come with me, Alejandro said, his voice a low command. I will recover your locket. I will ensure your father's debt is finally settled. But from this moment forward, you belong to me. Belong to you? Sophie whispered, the words catching in her throat. Like I am some kind of property? Like you are my partner, Alessandro corrected her. I have a need for your mind. You have a need for my protection until Greco is eliminated. You are Sophie Moretti. Sophie was frozen with indecision. Then, as the distant sound of police sirens started to grow louder, she placed her small hand into his. He pulled her to her feet, drawing her close against him, and for one fleeting second, she actually felt safe. Let us go home, he murmured. But the penthouse was not a home. It was a fortress built in the sky. The elevator doors opened silently, revealing a living room that was bigger than her entire apartment building. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking, glittering view of the Manhattan skyline. The furniture was sleek, Italian, and severe. Every piece was either black, white, or chrome. It was a stunning space, but it was also cold and overwhelmingly masculine. Dante, Alessandro barked the moment they stepped inside. Secure the entire perimeter immediately. I want double the number of guards posted in the lobby. No one is to come up to this floor unless I personally authorize it. And tell the chef to prepare a light meal. Also, get a doctor up here. I do not need a doctor, Sophie said, wrapping her arms around herself. She was still in her waitress uniform, which was now stained with spilled wine and covered in dust. She felt completely and utterly out of place. You have cuts on your arms from the broken glass, Alessandro noted, loosening his tie as he spoke. He moved over to a fully stocked wet bar and poured a generous amount of amber liquid into 2 glasses. He walked back to her and handed one over. It is brandy. Drink it. Sophie took a small sip. The liquid burned its way down her throat, but it began to calm her frayed nerves. There is a guest room just down the hall, Alessandro said with a gesture. You will find clothes in the closet. They are some of my sister's old things. She often leaves them here. They should be a good fit for you. Take a shower, change your clothes, and then meet me in my study. And what if I refuse? Sophie challenged, a small flicker of her old defiance finally returning. Alessandro stopped what he was doing. He looked at her with an intensity that made her legs feel weak. The door is unlocked, Sophie. You are free to leave at any time, but out there, you are nothing but prey. In here, you are my guest. The choice is yours. He turned without another word and walked toward a set of heavy, dark wood double doors, leaving her standing alone in the vast, silent room. Sophie stared back at the elevator. She could make a run for it. She could go to the police for help. But the police were probably on Greco's payroll, or maybe even Alessandro's. Her father had taught her that valuable lesson long ago. There is no such thing as law, little one, Arthur used to tell her. There is only power. She turned away from the elevator and walked toward the guest room. The shower was like a powerful waterfall of hot water that washed away the grime from the restaurant and the dust from her demolished apartment. She scrubbed her skin until it was raw and pink. When she stepped out, she found the clothes Alessandro had mentioned. There were silk blouses and cashmere sweaters, She selected a simple, oversized white shirt and a pair of black leggings. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. The girl who stared back at her looked different, harder. She walked down the hall to the study. The doors were slightly ajar. Inside, the room was lined from floor to ceiling with books. Alessandro was seated behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by multiple computer monitors and towering stacks of paper. He had changed into a black t-shirt that revealed muscular arms covered in intricate tattoos, dark ink that looked like vines and thorns wrapping around his biceps. "Much better," he commented, without looking up from the document he was reading. "You said you needed my brain," Sophie said, stopping directly in front of his desk. "I have to assume you do not need me to list the best wine vintages." Alessandro slid a single sheet of paper across the polished surface of the desk. It was old and yellowed with age, and it was covered in a handwritten cipher. "This is a letter your father sent to me 3 days before he disappeared," Alessandro explained. "We intercepted it, but we have never been able to crack the code. My expert cryptographers claim it is complete gibberish, just random lines from French poetry." Sophie reached out and picked up the paper, her breath catching in her throat. She instantly recognized her father's handwriting, the distinct way he looped his L's and made his T's sharp. "It is not random at all," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Read it aloud." Sophie's eyes scanned the text. "The moonlight shines on the forgotten vineyard, where the fox sleeps soundly under the 9th stone," she translated slowly. "We are aware of what it says in English," Alessandro said, his tone filled with impatience. "But it is meaningless. There is no vineyard. There is no fox." "It is a book code," Sophie explained, her mind racing, pulling memories from her childhood. "My father, he used to read me very specific stories. The Little Prince, Les Miserables. But this," she tapped the paper with her finger, "the fox is a reference to Aesop's Fables, the 1890 edition. He owned a first edition that he kept in his library." Alessandro shot up from his chair. "And the 9th stone? Is that page 9 or perhaps the 9th fable?" "It refers to the fox and the grapes," Sophie said, looking up to meet Alessandro's gaze. "He was not telling you where the money was located. He was telling you where the key is." "Where is it?" Alessandro demanded, leaning his weight across the massive desk. "The forgotten vineyard," Sophie murmured, closing her eyes to concentrate. "When I was 10 years old, we buried a time capsule in the old vineyard in Provence. Right before we lost the entire estate, we buried it under the 9th stone of the garden wall." Alessandro's eyes widened in understanding. "Provence. The drive is located in France." "If he has not moved it since then," Sophie confirmed. "We must go now," Alessandro said instantly. He slammed a button on his desk phone. "Dante, prepare the jet. We are leaving for Marseille in 1 hour." "Wait a minute," Sophie cried out. "I am not going to France with you. I am a wanted person there, thanks to my father's debts." Alessandro walked around the desk until he was standing just inches away from her. The air between them felt charged with electricity. "I own the French customs agents at the Marseille airport," he said, his voice a low growl. "You will not be arrested. But you are the only one who can find that specific stone. You are the only one who knows the layout of that estate." He reached out and gently tucked a damp strand of her hair behind her ear. His touch was surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. "Help me find this drive, Sophie. Help me utterly destroy Greco, and I promise I will give you your life back. I will clear all of your debts. I will even buy you l'Étoile Noire if that is what you want." "I do not want the restaurant," Sophie said, her voice breathless. "I want my father." A shadow crossed Alessandro's face. He glanced away for just a fraction of a second, but it was a hesitation that Sophie immediately caught. "What is it?" she asked sharply. "What are you not telling me? Sophie, is he dead?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "Tell me the truth." Alessandro grabbed her by the shoulders. "He is not dead." "But he is not simply missing, is he, Sophie? He did not just run away." Then where is he? She demanded. Alessandro took a deep, steadying breath. He is being held in the dungeon of Stefano Greco's villa in Tuscany. He has been imprisoned there for the last 3 years. That letter, it was not sent before he vanished. It was smuggled out of the villa just last week. Sophie's entire world began to tilt on its axis. He is alive, and you knew this whole time. I only suspected it. The letter was the confirmation. We have to go get him, Sophie shouted, pulling away from his grasp. Forget about the drive. We have to save him now. We cannot save him without the drive, Alessandro roared back, his voice echoing in the large room. Greco is holding him as leverage to get the codes on that drive. If we storm the villa without it, he will kill your father instantly. Arthur. If we follow Greco's rules, he will kill Arthur. There is only one path forward, and it means getting that drive before he does. Once we have it, we will decode the financial accounts and completely freeze every asset Greco possesses. When his money vanishes, his army will desert him. Only then do we move in. Sophie could only stare at him, her breath catching in her throat as the weight of their situation crashed down on her. This was no longer just about finances or revenge. This was a fight for her father's life. She gazed at the imposing man who stood before her, a Mafia don, a figure born from nightmares. And he was, impossibly, her last hope. We go to France, Sophie declared, her voice finding a sudden, hard strength. We have to go now. Alessandro gave a single, sharp nod. Find your coat. As Sophie began to turn away, a file sitting on the edge of his mahogany desk snagged her attention. It was slightly ajar. Through the opening, she saw a photograph clipped securely to the top page. It was a picture of her. A candid shot taken from the other side of the street outside Leto Noir just 2 weeks ago. The air left her lungs. You knew, she whispered, the words barely forming. She spun back to face him, the sharp sting of betrayal flooding her eyes. You never came to the restaurant for a meal that night. You were there for me. Alessandro made no attempt to deny the accusation. He stood unmoving, a tall silhouette against the dark city skyline. I came to determine if Arthur Dubois's daughter was going to be worth all the trouble, he stated, his voice calm and even. And, Sophie challenged him, hot tears beginning to well in her eyes, threatening to spill over. Am I? Alessandro closed the distance between them. He moved with a predator's grace and did not stop until his chest was just barely touching hers. He tilted his head down, his dark eyes burning with an intense fire, a mix of raw possession and something that felt terrifyingly like genuine affection. Read the menu, Sophie, he murmured, the words a deliberate echo of how their night had started. You are worth, he said, his voice turning rough and low, setting the whole world on fire for. Their private jet landed on a secluded airstrip somewhere outside Marseille as the first light of dawn started to stain the horizon. It painted the vast French countryside in deep, bruised shades of purple and gold. The flight had been silent and tense. Alessandro had spent the majority of the journey on his encrypted satellite phone. He barked sharp commands in fluent Italian to his men back in New York while simultaneously organizing a separate strike team in Tuscany. Sophie had spent the hours gazing out the small window, her fingers twisting the soft fabric of the leggings she had borrowed. Her mind was a battlefield, filled with warring memories and fears. A plain, unmarked rental car, a dusty old Peugeot, was waiting for them on the tarmac. Sophie said softly after nearly an hour of navigating winding roads flanked by tall, silent cypress trees. You need to turn left at the very next crossroads. The paved road stops there. They soon turned onto a bumpy gravel track. A faded sign almost completely consumed by thick green ivy, faintly read, Château du Bois. The once grand estate was now just a ghost of its former glory. The main house, which had been a sprawling manor built from warm, yellow stone, was now entirely boarded up, its wide roof sagging dangerously in the middle. But the vineyard, her father's vineyard, was utterly wild. The vines that had once yielded award-winning Syrah grapes were now a tangled, thorny mess, a chaotic thicket that was slowly strangling all life from the rich soil. "Stop the car here," Sophie whispered urgently. "We need to walk the rest of the way. The sound of the engine will carry up to the house." Alessandro immediately cut the power. He reached into the back of the car and retrieved a heavy duffel bag. He passed a flashlight to Sophie, but kept his right hand resting firmly on the holster of his gun. "You will stay directly behind me. If you spot anyone, you immediately drop flat to the ground. You do not make a sound. You do not run. Do you understand me?" "Alessandro, I spent my childhood playing hide-and-seek between these very rows," Sophie replied, her voice steady as she stepped out into the crisp, cool morning air. The familiar smell of wild thyme and damp earth filled her senses, causing a painful ache deep in her chest. "I know better than anyone how to become invisible here." They moved like shadows through the overgrown vineyard. The silence was profound and heavy, punctuated only by the sharp crunch of dried leaves under their heavy boots. "The old garden wall is on the north side of the property," Sophie directed in a low voice. They finally reached the ancient stone wall that marked the estate's boundary. It was thick with dark green moss. Sophie ran her fingers over the cool stones, her breath catching in her throat. 1, 2, 3. "It is here." She pointed to a large, flat river stone located near the bottom of the wall, precisely the 9th stone from the corner. Alessandro knelt down without a word. He pulled a slim, sharp knife from his boot and carefully wedged the tip beneath the stone. With a low grunt of exertion, he pried it loose. In the hollow space underneath, resting in the dark soil, was a rusted tin box, an old biscuit tin from her childhood. Sophie dropped to her knees and snatched it up. Her hands were shaking so violently that she could not manage to pry the lid free. Alessandro's large, warm hands gently covered her own. "Let me." He popped the lid open with ease. A faint, stale paper smell drifted out. Inside lay a collection of childhood treasures, including a pressed, dried flower and a tiny toy soldier. There was a child's drawing of a horse, and secured to the very bottom of the tin with yellowed tape was a small silver USB drive. "He did it," Sophie breathed, the tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "He actually managed to hide it here." "Secure it," Alessandro ordered, his sharp eyes constantly scanning the dark, imposing tree line. "We have what we came for. Now we leave." The click was sharp and unmistakable. It was the sound of a gun's hammer being cocked. "Do not move," a voice sneered from deep within the shadows of the vines. "And drop your weapon, Moretti. That is, unless you want to see this girl's brains fertilize these grapes." Alessandro's entire body went perfectly still. He slowly, deliberately, raised his empty hands. From the darkness, 3 armed men emerged. Their leader was a mountain of a man. He had a brutal scar that sliced through his left eyebrow. He was aiming a suppressed MP5 submachine gun directly at the center of Sophie's chest. "Luca," Alessandro said, his tone one of casual, almost bored recognition. "I see Greco finally decided to let you off your leash. He figured you would come sniffing around for the girl's inheritance." Luca grinned maliciously. "Now, hand over the drive." "And if I do not?" Alessandro asked calmly. "Then I will kill her, take the drive anyway, and leave your corpse here for the crows to feast on." Alessandro's gaze locked onto Sophie's. In that silent moment, his eyes conveyed a clear and urgent message. "Trust me." "Fine," Alessandro said with a sigh. He reached into the tin, plucked out the small drive, and held it up between his thumb and forefinger. The silver metal glinted faintly in the early dawn light. "You want it so badly? Then catch." With a flick of his wrist, Alessandro tossed the drive high into the air, aiming it toward the densest part of the thorny thicket to his right. Luca's eyes, and those of his men, instinctively followed the glittering arc of the tiny silver object. That single split second of distraction was all Alessandro required. He ignored his own weapon. Instead, he lunged directly at Sophie, tackling her hard into the dirt behind the relative safety of the stone wall, just as Luca instinctively pulled the trigger. A spray of bullets chipped away at the stone just inches above their heads. "Stay down!" Alessandro roared in her ear. He immediately rolled onto his back, drawing his own pistol in a single fluid motion and firing a volley of shots blindly over the top of the wall. A pained scream ripped through the morning air. One of the henchmen crumpled to the ground. "Get to the vines, now!" Alessandro commanded, grabbing the collar of Sophie's shirt and pulling her deep into the thick, protective cover of the overgrown grapes. They scrambled desperately on their hands and knees through the cold dirt, sharp thorns tearing at Sophie's clothes and scratching her skin. Behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps crunched on dry leaves. "Spread out and find them!" Luca bellowed in frustration. "The drive!" Sophie hissed, sheer panic seizing her. "You just threw it away!" "I threw the toy soldier!" Alessandro gritted out, expertly reloading a fresh clip into his pistol as they huddled behind a thick, gnarled vine trunk. He tapped his chest pocket with the barrel of his gun. "The drive is right here." Sophie could only stare at him in disbelief. "You are completely insane. I am practical. Now listen to me very carefully. I am going to draw their fire. The moment I do, you run for the car. Do not stop and do not look back." "No." Sophie grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "I am not leaving you here." Alessandro looked down at her. For just a fraction of a second, the cold mask of the Mafia Don slipped, revealing a man who was utterly terrified of losing the one thing of value he had only just discovered. "Sophie, I am begging you." "They are flanking to the left," Sophie whispered urgently, her ears perfectly attuned to the subtle sounds of the vineyard she knew by heart. She pointed with a trembling finger. "There is an old irrigation ditch about 10 yards in that direction. It runs all the way back to the road. We can both make it out of here." Alessandro followed the direction she had pointed. Then his gaze returned to her, and a fierce, wild grin spread across his face. "Lead the way, mademoiselle." They moved in perfect unison, a synchronized unit born of desperation. They slid into the dry, dusty ditch just as a hail of bullets shredded the very vines where they had been hiding moments before. They ran, staying low, their lungs burning for air, until the blessed shape of the rental car finally came into view. Alessandro vaulted over the door and into the driver's seat as Sophie scrambled into the passenger side. He roared the engine to life, spinning the car around in a chaotic spray of dirt and gravel, just as Luca burst from the tree line, firing his weapon wildly. The rear windshield exploded inward with a deafening crash. Sophie screamed, instinctively ducking her head. Alessandro slammed the car into gear and floored the accelerator. The little Peugeot rocketed down the dirt track, leaving the furious gunman shrinking in a cloud of dust. "Are you hit?" Alessandro shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind rushing through the shattered rear window. "No!" Sophie quickly checked herself over. She was covered in bleeding scratches from the thorns, but there were no bullet holes. She looked over at Alessandro. He was grinning, a wild, adrenaline-fueled grin that was both terrifying and captivating. "You did well back there, Sophie." He actually laughed. "You did very, very good." Sophie looked at the dangerous man sitting beside her. He was lethal and unpredictable, and at that moment, the most exhilarating thing she had ever known in her life. "So, to Tuscany?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Alessandro's grin vanished instantly, replaced by a look of cold, hard determination. "To Tuscany," he confirmed, "to kill a monster." Stefano Greco's villa was a modern fortress built with blood money, perched arrogantly in the serene, rolling hills of Tuscany. The estate was breathtakingly beautiful, ancient, and rotting from the inside out with corruption. Night had completely fallen by the time Alessandro and Sophie arrived. There was no sneaking in this time. They drove directly up to the imposing front gate in a sleek black Mercedes that had been provided by Alessandro's local contacts. Alessandro was now dressed in a fresh, impeccably tailored suit, all black. Sophie wore a striking red dress, a stark contrast to the cheap uniform from Leto Noir. This was a silk gown that Alessandro had someone procure for her in Florence. She looked like a queen about to ascend her throne. She felt like a lamb being led to slaughter. "Remember our plan," Alessandro said in a low voice, as the heavy iron gates groaned open to admit them. "You are the leverage we need. I am the interested buyer. Under no circumstances do we show any fear." "I am not afraid," Sophie lied through her teeth. "Good," he replied, "because a man like Greco feeds on the fear of others." They were escorted by heavily armed guards into the villa's main hall. It was a vast, cavernous room, filled with priceless Renaissance art that seemed to mock the distinct, unpleasant smell of sulfur hanging in the air. Stefano Greco sat alone at the head of a long, empty banquet table. He was a small, oily man with dead, vacant eyes and a repulsive smile that revealed far too much of his gums. "Alessandro!" Greco exclaimed, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of false welcome. "And the pretty little waitress. Welcome to my home. Welcome. I do hope your flight was comfortable." "Let's cut the pleasantries, Stefano." Alessandro's voice was like ice, echoing off the high stone walls. He refused to sit down. He remained standing directly behind Sophie's chair, placing a firm, protective hand on her shoulder. "We are in possession of the drive." "Are you now?" Greco sneered as he took a slow sip of his wine. "Then by all means, show me." Alessandro retrieved the silver USB drive from his pocket and tossed it onto the center of the table. "Arthur Dubois." In exchange for him, Greco snapped his fingers with a sharp crack. A side door creaked open. Two large guards emerged, dragging a beaten man between them. Sophie gasped, her heart stopping. "Papa!" The man before her was a ghost. Arthur Dubois, once so strong, was now a gaunt and broken figure, his face a canvas of bruises with one eye swollen completely shut. He could barely stand, stumbling with each agonizing step. "Sophie," he rasped, forcing his head up. His voice was a dry crackle of sound. "No, Sophie, you must run." "Let him go," Sophie insisted, her voice trembling with rage as she began to stand. But a powerful hand from Alessandro clamped down on her shoulder, holding her in place. "The drive comes first," Greco said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. He lifted the small USB stick and slid it into a laptop on the grand table. After typing for a few seconds, his smile vanished, replaced by a deep frown. "It is encrypted," Greco hissed. "There is a biometric lock. Voice recognition is required." His cold eyes shifted to Sophie, a flicker of grudging respect in them. "That was very clever, Arthur," Greco sneered. He made his own daughter the key to his entire world. Alessandro's grip on Sophie's shoulder became a vice. "She will give you access," he stated, "but only after Arthur is safely in the car and already on his way to the airport." Greco let out a harsh, rasping laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "You are in absolutely no position to make demands, boy. I have 50 of my men surrounding this property. You, on the other hand, have a waitress." To punctuate his point, Greco produced a pistol from beneath the table, aiming it directly at Arthur's head. "Unlock the drive now, Sophie, or your father is going to redecorate that wall." "No!" Sophie cried out in terror. "Do it!" Greco commanded, the click of the hammer being pulled back echoing in the tense silence. Sophie's desperate gaze found Alessandro. His expression was a flawless mask of stone, completely unreadable, but the hand on her shoulder gave two distinct, firm squeezes. It was a signal. It was a promise. Sophie rose to her feet with newfound resolve. She crossed the long room, walking deliberately toward the laptop, feeling the hostile stares of every single guard follow her every move. As she leaned over the glowing screen, a prompt requested a specific voice phrase for authentication. She lifted her head and met Greco's predatory gaze. "You want the code?" she asked, her voice steady. I want the entire world, my dear, he replied with a greedy smirk. Now give it to me. Sophie bent toward the computer's microphone. The fox knows many tricks, she recited clearly in perfect French, but the hedgehog knows one big one. Instantly, the screen flashed a brilliant green. Access granted. Lines of data began to cascade down the display. Bank accounts, confidential routing numbers, the complete architectural blueprint of Greco's whole criminal syndicate. Greco's eyes widened, consumed by an overwhelming wave of pure avarice. Yes, yes, he whispered, his eyes glued to the screen. It is all right here. He finally tore his gaze away and looked at his guards. You know what to do. Kill every one of them. Sophie's blood ran cold and she froze in place. A deal is still a deal, Stefano. Alessandro's voice was low, rumbling with a terrifying menace. Greco just laughed, his attention already returning to the stream of data. I am a criminal, Alessandro, not a businessman. I do not make deals. I make corpses. So do I, Alessandro replied, and in that same instant, the room was plunged into absolute darkness. Utter chaos erupted. Alessandro had acted even before the lights were completely gone. He had triggered a remote device in his pocket, which was linked to the main power and set on a timer that started the exact moment Sophie finished speaking her code phrase. In the suffocating pitch black, the sound of gunfire exploded from all directions. Alessandro immediately threw himself at Sophie, his body covering hers as he fired 3 precise shots toward the last known position of Greco's men. He was wearing advanced night vision contact lenses. His enemies were completely blind. Get Arthur, Alessandro commanded, his voice a roar in the darkness. Sophie scrambled across the cold floor, crawling desperately toward the spot where she had last seen her father fall. Papa, Papa! Her hand finally found his, frail and cold. I have you, Sophie, Arthur wheezed, his breathing shallow. You need to go. She shook her head fiercely. I am not leaving without you. Just then, the emergency lights sputtered to life, casting the entire room in a dim, hellish red glow that made everything look as though it were drenched in blood. In the crimson light, Alessandro was a phantom, a blur of deadly motion, his actions brutally efficient. He disarmed one guard, immediately using the man's body as a human shield against another, methodically clearing a path to the exit. But Greco was already gone. The laptop had vanished with him. He is running! Alessandro shouted over the noise. Get your father to the car. Dante is waiting for you at the back gate. Where are you going? Sophie screamed, struggling to support her father's weight. To end this once and for all, Alessandro said, then turned and sprinted toward a side door without another word. Sophie dragged her father through the wreckage of the room, dodging overturned tables and fallen chairs. They burst out into a large courtyard where a black Mercedes was idling. Dante, their ever-loyal bodyguard, was already there, laying down cover fire. Get inside, now! Dante yelled. Sophie managed to push her father into the safety of the back seat, but she did not follow him. She looked back toward the villa, hearing the distinct sound of more gunshots from within. Go now! Sophie yelled, slamming the heavy car door shut. Get him to safety! Sophie, no! Arthur screamed from inside the car, his voice filled with panic. Drive, Dante! Sophie commanded with an authority she did not know she possessed. The Mercedes tore away, its tires squealing on the pavement. Sophie turned and ran straight back into the heart of the villa. She was no longer just a waitress. She was not a victim. She was a woman in love with a dangerous king, and she would not let him face his enemies and die all by himself. She discovered them in the mansion's vast library. Greco was cowering behind a massive oak desk, clutching the precious laptop to his chest. Alessandro was positioned behind a thick marble pillar, and it was clear from his movements that his ammunition was running dangerously low. It is finished, Alessandro, Greco shouted triumphantly. I have all the accounts. I am transferring every last dollar right this second. You have absolutely nothing, Alessandro yelled back in defiance. From her vantage point, Sophie could see Greco's finger poised above the laptop's enter key. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use. She saw it then, a heavy bronze bust of Julius Caesar, perched on a high shelf directly above Greco's head. The shelf itself was supported by just a single, ornate wooden bracket. Sophie did not have a weapon, but she had snatched a heavy magnum bottle of wine from a banquet table on her way in. She did not hesitate. She did not overthink it. She acted purely on instinct. With all the strength she could muster, she hurled the bottle. Her target was not Greco. Her target was the wooden bracket. The bottle shattered against the wood with a loud crack. The bracket gave way instantly. The heavy bronze bust of the Roman emperor tipped forward and plummeted. It landed on Greco's arm with a sickening, wet crunch of breaking bone. Greco let out an agonized scream, the laptop tumbling from his grasp. His gun clattered across the polished floor. Alessandro immediately stepped out from behind the pillar. His movements were fluid and certain. He did not pause. He raised his pistol and fired a single, final, decisive shot. Stefano Greco collapsed forward over the desk. An unnerving silence descended upon the grand room. Alessandro stood over the body, his chest heaving from the exertion. He looked from the dead man to the laptop, and then his eyes found Sophie, standing in the doorway, breathless, her elegant red dress now torn, her hands empty. He slowly walked over to her. Without uttering a single word, he took her face between his hands, and he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of raw survival, of surging adrenaline, and of complete and absolute possession. It tasted of gunpowder, blood, and the sweet satisfaction of victory. He finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. "I told you to get in the car," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I do not take orders very well," Sophie whispered back, a faint smile on her lips. "I am French." A short, breathy laugh escaped Alessandro. He glanced over at the fallen laptop. "He did not get the chance to transfer the money, did he?" Sophie asked. "No," Alessandro confirmed. "Because the phrase you spoke did not unlock the funds. It uploaded a custom-made virus that has now wiped every single server he owned. He died a completely broke man." Sophie's smile widened. "The hedgehog knows one big trick," she repeated softly. Alessandro then swept her up into his arms, easily ignoring her faint protests. "Let us go home, Sophie. I am starving." 6 months later, the rain falling on Manhattan was a gentle mist. Inside Le Cygne Noir, the air was electric with a new kind of energy. The celebrated restaurant was now under entirely new management. Sophie moved with confidence among the tables, no longer an invisible servant, but the commanding owner. She wore a perfectly tailored suit, her posture radiating authority. She paused at table number 4. Arthur Dubois sat there, looking vibrant and healthy, calmly sipping a cup of tea as he read a newspaper. He looked up and gave his daughter a warm, proud smile. "The inventory is complete, Papa," Sophie reported, leaning down to kiss his cheek. "Good," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Now go. He is waiting for you." Sophie made her way to the restaurant's most private booth in the back. Alessandro Moretti was sitting there. He was not wearing one of his usual dark suits. Instead, he wore a casual sweater that made him look younger, far more relaxed. The deep, lingering darkness that had always clouded his eyes seemed to have been replaced by a constant, steady warmth. On the table between them sat a single bottle of expensive wine. "Chateau Mouton Rothschild, 1982, Sophie observed as she sat down across from him. "That is a very bold choice for a Tuesday." "I am celebrating," Alessandro replied simply. "And what exactly are we celebrating?" she asked. Alessandro reached into his coat pocket. He did not retrieve a weapon. He did not pull out a data drive. Instead, he placed a small dark velvet box on the center of the table. "I have finally found someone who can actually read the entire menu," he said, a playful smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "And I have no intention of ever letting her dine by herself again." Sophie's gaze shifted from the velvet box back to his intense eyes. "Is that a command, Mr. Moretti?" she asked, her tone light and teasing. No, Sophie. It is a proposal. A genuine smile bloomed on Sophie's face. The very same smile that had once brought a criminal empire crashing down to its knees. She reached gracefully for her empty wine glass. Then you should pour the wine, Alessandro. It appears we have a great deal to discuss. And that is the story of how Sophie Dubois transformed herself from the overlooked girl at table 4 into the undisputed queen of the New York underworld. She proved to everyone that real power does not come from muscles or guns. It comes from superior intelligence, unwavering courage, and knowing the perfect vintage of wine to serve alongside revenge. Alessandro Moretti was convinced that he was the one saving her that night, but in the end, it was Sophie who truly saved him. If you enjoyed this tale of incredible danger, unlikely romance, and deeply satisfying justice, please take a moment to hit that like button. Your support really does help this channel grow. Remember to subscribe and turn on all your notifications so you will never miss a new story. And please tell me in the comments section below, if you were in Sophie's position, would you have run back into that villa? I am looking forward to reading your answers. I will see you all in the next video. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to bring you meaningful lessons and inspiration. Thank you for being part of this journey.